Good afternoon. Hope you can all hear me. My name's Stuart McMillan. I'm a finance partner in the energy and infrastructure team at Burgess Salmon. Title for this session is Where is the money coming from? How net zero opportunities across energy and infrastructure stack up and increasingly look like good investments. So to discuss that, we've invited a panel, a really good mix of asset owners, developers, investors and funders to come onto the panel, really to look at where we are now, any barriers that there are to funding and investment, and just to see how we can maybe unlock these. So I've got a great panel from my left, Peter Radford, who's an investment manager at Amber Infrastructure, David Rose, a partner at Rock Rail and Rock Roads, Robert Minter, a director at the UK Infrastructure Bank, and Simon Cordray, a senior property and commercial manager at TTL Properties. So to start us off, let you each introduce yourself and maybe give us a few thoughts, if you can, under the bright lights, on what you're doing at the moment and your thoughts in the market. So Peter, do you want to kick off for us?
Great. Afternoon all, hope you can hear me. I'm Pete Radford from Amber Infrastructure. Just very briefly, Amber is a fund manager and developer in the infrastructure space. We look after some funds in UK, US, Europe, and Australia. And through those funds, we've had the pleasure of looking at the whole spectrum of, I would say, of the energy transition kind of sectors, all the way from last mile delivery through to owning a train leasing company in Poland. So as Stu said, in terms of where do I think we are now, I think we've made a really good start. And we're now at that curve where it could go like an S shape. Hopefully it will go like an S shape. We've got some really good SMEs that are sort of innovators in some key sectors to help us create that transition and momentum. And I think the key now is making sure that we can grow those SMEs over the next few years, because we are in a global competition here to get to net zero as quick as we can.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Rose, and I'm a partner in the origination team at Rock Rail and Rock Road. So for those of you who don't know us, we're a developer, owner, and asset manager of public transport vehicles in the UK and Germany. We entered the market back in 2016, and since then we've invested about £3 billion in trains and rail infrastructure in the UK. So we own 5 fleets of trains, all greener than the trains they replaced. And it's a mixture of commuter, intercity trains, different types. We own those vehicles and we lease them to the public transport operators who will run the services, and we then take the risk that somebody else still wants those trains at the end of the lease. So we've been very successful in the rail market. Last year, we made our first investment in battery electric buses, which is a really exciting sector and one that we want to do a lot more work in. My job is to really look for projects that are suitable for institutional investors to put their money into. So these are kind of pension funds, people like that, who are really looking for long-term, low-risk investments, and public transport assets can be very well suited to that. For that investor base, I'd say that decarbonisation and net zero targets are becoming more and more important. It's something that's being looked at really closely. And investing in greener public transport vehicles is really good for 2 reasons. I mean, firstly, getting people out of their private cars helps, and also using less energy and other things than the vehicles that they're replacing is really important. So I think transport is the emitter of carbon in the UK. It's about 24% of what we emit. So clearly that's something that we're going to need to make a big dent in if we're going to hit net zero targets. So from my point of view, what we're really looking at is we're bringing in more kind of zero emission or cleaner vehicles, and trying to do that against a backdrop of COVID that's really disrupted the market. We're not quite back to where we were before COVID in terms of public transport journeys, but we're pretty much back up to 90% now. So we think that it's a great time to be investing in the sector.
Thanks, David. Rob?
Hi everybody, I'm Rob Minter. I'm a director within the banking and investments team at the UK Infrastructure Bank. And for those who don't know what UKIB is, we are a government-owned policy bank, and we were set up just under 2 years ago. We've been set up with £22 billion of capital, with which to invest in meeting our 2 policy aims, which is getting the country to net zero and also to help drive regional, local and economic growth. So we issued our strategic plan last year, and in that we identified a number of priority sectors, of which clean energy will be the main one for us, but also transport, we see we've got a key role to play there as well. So we've been set up with a aim to be additional to the market. So we are here to bring our capital, not to replace capital that's already available, but to help crowd in more private capital. I think where we are at the moment in the market is a real scale-up is going to be needed over the next few years if the country is going to meet government ambition. So we're seeing lots of investment already. What we want to do is to use our capital to help increase the investor base and draw in more capital, particularly into nascent sectors. So it's a really interesting time for the bank to be setting up. We've been going, as I say, for over 18 months now, already deployed over £1 billion worth of capital, but plenty more to go. And transport is my personal focus at the bank. And we're involved in quite a few areas of transport at the moment, including EV, where we inherited the Charging Infrastructure Investment Fund, which is helping provide bridging equity for the smaller charge point operators as they start the early sort of scale up phase of their business. And we are also able to invest right the way across the capital stack. So we can do direct equity ourselves, but also senior debt through to financial guarantees. So we've got a real broad range of products that are available for the market. And how we sort of play in individual sectors and projects very much depends on what the needs of the market are. But yeah, we're very much open for business and see it's a really exciting time for the market at the moment. And yeah, we're really looking to deploy our £22 billion efficiently to draw in as much capital as we can.
That's great news. Simon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Simon Cordery. I recently joined TTLP, which, for those who don't know, is the property arm of TfL, Transport for London. We are effectively involved in several areas of real estate across the operational and legacy asset base. We run the properties within the Transport for London empire. We also do several types of development, including commercial office space. We recently signed a joint venture with Helical to do above station development around stations like Paddington and Bank. We do a lot of social housing with Grainger in London. And the third thing we are doing, which is my area where I've recently joined the team, is we are looking to roll out a portfolio of 50 to 100 EV charging hubs of somewhere between 6 and 12 chargers plus associated retail and amenity across sites that are as diverse as train and tube station car parks, looking at opportunities around bus stations for pop-up charging during the times when buses are out on the road. We're looking at legacy land that is unused as a result of a road scheme, road widening, new roundabouts, that kind of thing. We've been around for 160 years as a transport provider, so every site has a story, which is often very interesting from a commercial development point of view. But look, we are committed to the idea of delivering an enabling infrastructure across London, which will provide, easy, straightforward, ultra-rapid, low-cost, reliable charging with a recognized brand. We're going out through a JV with the CPOs in the sector. So it's a fascinating area to be involved in. I've been involved across real estate and distributed energy for many decades. But I think the interesting thing about this conference and the opportunity to speak here is about, it's about interfaces, different types of things coming together, public and private transport. It's about road and rail. It's about modes of transport, the transitions between those modes, whether that's from rail to vehicle, to bicycle, to scooter, to train, to tram, and really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's a really good point. This is quite a broad sector with a lot to get done over the next few years, especially if we're going to get to reach our net zero targets. So keen to get onto the questions. We'll keep an eye on Slido, so if anybody in the audience has any questions, just put them up and we'll tackle these. But the first one I had, was really just to assess where we are now in terms of the sector, in terms of getting funding, both from funders and investors into the transports and energy sector. And what are the main challenges in doing that, and how are these being addressed? So, Peter, I'd like to start with you.
Great, thank you. I think that's a good question. I think we are making progress. We are one of the early adopters, I would say, compared to some of our, some of the other countries. And what we need to do is now build on that and really accelerate the growth and the investment. I think maybe we've seen pots of capital with different appetite, and I think that's key to make sure that when we're developing projects, we're thinking about what type of capital best suits that project. In the early stage, that'll probably be an element of grant funding, maybe alongside some private equity. And as those technologies mature, the key is then to bring in that institutional capital and the senior debt so that we can really get scale. So I think depending on which sector you're looking at and depending on the type of infrastructure that you're looking to deploy, we're either at that point where I think we're just about to unleash the institutional and senior debt capital. Maybe to date, it's probably been more grant and private equity focused. So I think we're really at that turning point, and it's the key now is that we put sort of our foot down and accelerate that capital deployment.
Thank you. David, do you want to come in? And see there's a rail question up there as well that you might want to tackle.
Looking forward to that one. I mean, look, in terms of the trains and buses that we buy, the technology risk isn't really a big concern for us in some ways. If you look at trains for an example, some people in the room will know, some people may not. I mean, whether trains run on overhead wires or diesel engines or batteries or even on hydrogen fuel cells, it's just a different way of making electricity and getting the electricity to kind of power a diesel motor. So even where it's a diesel train, that diesel engine is generating electricity. So in terms of the technology, I mean, we know that it works, even where we haven't had trains in the UK, we've seen them elsewhere in Europe. So even the kind of some of the hydrogen schemes that people think are quite new, it's just a different way of making electricity. And you obviously need to look at the safety case of having that equipment on board a train very, very carefully. But the technology itself works. I think that the challenge is more around kind of operators understanding those systems, and that's perhaps more relevant with our buses, making sure that they've got enough charge to do the full day. And as that's quite a new technology, where we're seeing that bus operators need to look at things like the temperature, because a battery will not perform so well if it's very cold. So the technology itself, I think, works very well. It's the transport operators are adapting and making changes to their depots and making changes to the way that they run those services to fit in with the new technology. But as an owner of the asset, we're very comfortable with the technology risk.
Thanks, David. And Rob, keen to hear from you where UKIB sits in all of this in terms of funding, equity, senior debt grants, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so as you outlined there, we've got a very broad product range that can go all the way from equity through to senior debt and financial guarantees. So we can take a very broad view of technology risk and other risks. And yeah, we can take more risk than the market can in certain circumstances, obviously in a very measured way. But we are set up to be a commercial institution and make a financial return. So really where we start to see a role for ourselves coming in is after the R&D stage, it's after the grant funding, and once technology is more proven. As David says, in transport, we don't necessarily see technology risk as being that great. For a lot of the kind of nascent sectors that we are getting involved in at the moment, it's much more around sort of merchant revenue risk and track record risk, and that's where we sort of see a role in, potentially taking a bit more risk, but actually just through our involvement, we can actually create a bit of a halo effect and show government support and actually help encourage other investors into the capital stack. But, if we sort of think of the project range from equity, we can sort of get involved right the way through the life cycle after grant funding. So, using equity as part of frontier investments, it's later stages of emerging technology, which is a bit too high risk for project finance, but we can start to help increase the capacity of equity markets and help that sort of early scale-up phase. But then we have that sort of role coming back in, as Peter outlined, of when you start to tap into senior debt, which is it's essential for the scale up later on, where actually you start to see that nervousness again, where getting senior lenders comfortable with merchant risks in nascent sectors is quite difficult. So we can play various roles there. We can either go in alongside the early senior debt investors that are able to take those risks and help improve the capacity of the market. We can again create that halo effect, or we can actually consider taking sort of higher risk, almost like first loss mezzanine type pieces to try and de-risk it for a wider pool of investors to crowd them in. So yeah, we've got a sort of very broad range of products, and we've got an appetite for taking measured risk. So yeah, it very much depends on the sectors and projects.
It's great. It sounds like you've got a lot in the armory there.
I think talking to the EV sector, I mean, we've heard from the previous speakers about the Levi Fund, which has provided a lot of grant funding to local authorities for on-street and lower speed charging. The interesting thing about the EV sector, when you look at actually the development of an asset which has 6, 12, 24 chargers, in comparison to a lot of other projects, they're not that expensive. You're talking about capex of between £1 million and £2 million. So one of the issues is that we don't really attract project finance at a site-specific level because we're just too small. We don't attract infrastructure funding at a site-specific level because we're just too small. And also there's an issue of merchant risk. No one's guaranteeing that a charger will be used unless you have a subscription. And, we're in London, we're talking to lots of people about the idea of the provision of, energy as a service to support various, private hire, transport, emergency services, blue light fleets. The list it grows by the day. But I think what is interesting is at the moment it's a lot of private equity. It's a lot of early seed risk money from sort of some of the more specialist infrastructure funds. But there is an anticipation, I think, that once the site grows, and given the scale of the challenge, that in aggregate, over time, merchant risk dissipates, as you don't have petrol and diesel and you have electric. The locations of sites become more important in terms of the catchments and the roads that they can serve. But over time, you also have, in aggregate, 100, 200 sites within a charge point operator or a utility, or a big oil company that pivots petrol stations towards EV. So one of the things that I heard in a conference, and I'll blatantly steal it, is look, cars are computers on wheels now, right? And it's taken 40 years for us to get the transition towards distributed computing systems, towards mobile telecoms, towards road and rail systems that have become very, very attractive to infrastructure funds. That if you look at 40 years in those sectors, it's all going to happen in 40 months in this sector, because the wave of innovation that is already happening, and also the wave of lessons learned and technology that can be applied to the EV sector simply by opening the gates of the electrification of transport means this is going to happen really, really quickly. So I think as merchant risk abates, as the portfolios of developers are growing, and seen to be growing, you will very quickly move towards, I think, infrastructure becoming a key player in this sector, because risk will reduce.
That's a really good point. There's a lot to do, and it's going to happen very quickly, and it needs to. David, I might come back to you. There was one question that's disappeared from this slide, but I think it essentially related to the need to decarbonise the rail network, get electrification of the railways. You want to say anything about that?
Yeah. So, look, our view, and I think most of the rest of the industry would agree, is that where a line is used enough, if it's a main line, it absolutely makes sense to electrify that line and run trains on overhead wires. And there is a big program of Network Rail looking to do just that. And as I say, it's taking a bit longer than some people would like it to. But there's no debate that that's both the greenest and the best value for money solution. I think when you look outside of the kind of main lines and you're looking at branch lines that aren't used quite as often, you need a different solution. And moving away from diesel, I mean, I think the two main choices are kind of battery trains and hydrogen trains, and we're certainly seeing more kind of traction towards battery trains at the moment. A really interesting solution that we're seeing, and some of the trains that ROC are looking to buy, are what we call bi-mode trains. So an example of that would be a train that can take electricity from the overhead wires where the line is electrified, but it can also do stretches kind of between the electrified sections where it will run on its battery power. Now, the great thing about that is if you have a stretch that's electrified and then a stretch that's not, it can recharge its batteries as well when it's running under the wires. And if you have some sections of line that are actually really expensive, really difficult to electrify, maybe you've got a listed building there or you've got really difficult topology, then actually buying that bi-mode train that can go under the wires and can use its batteries, or hydrogen or something else when it's not there, that can be a really good solution for decarbonising the railway. So these are the kind of solutions that we're seeing. But yes, electrification where the line is used frequently and it can be electrified makes a lot of sense.
Great. Another theme that I wanted to mention is scalability. That you read every other day about local authorities, developers bringing new schemes to market that are all really exciting and innovative, and that's positive, obviously. But to what extent do we need to find a way to make these more scalable for investors to actually invest and fund them, while still making sure that we keep that innovation and competitiveness? Maybe start with you on that, if I can, Pete.
Yeah, I think local authorities have a big role to play as we transition to low carbon infrastructure. I think that from an investor perspective, scale is a key thing. We have funds to deploy within a certain time frame, while recognising though that we are in a sector that is fairly nascent and there's a significant amount of growth. Could we invest in something a little bit smaller at the moment, which we can see we can repeat and repeat and repeat? That would be the aim. I think some local authorities have made a really good start at sort of clubbing together and bringing together procurement frameworks. Whether there's maybe a role for combined authorities as well to bring scale together, so when they come out to market, you've got a number of local authorities all coming to scale. And I think that would be attractive to investors. And also, it will speed up the procurement if you've got one doing multiple. That said, we are in an innovative sector, and I do think SMEs have a role to play here. So, having that option of multiple responses back in is still a good thing. But yeah, I think there's probably a role for combined authorities to play in this.
Rob, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think you know what, we're actually pretty good in the UK in terms of government intervention, of grant schemes that are helping sort of fund SMEs and smaller entities that bring innovation to the market. I think on one hand, you can stand back and look at the market, and particularly thinking of EV, and say, well, actually, it's quite fragmented and a bit disjointed, and there's lots of players around at the moment. But actually, it's that kind of environment with the appropriate R&D funding and support that actually generates innovation. When it comes to scalability, I do see that over the next few years, there probably will be that round of consolidation, and you'll start to see some mergers and acquisitions of some of these sort of SMEs start to come together and build scale. And that's probably at the point in the kind of capital raising journey as well, that a lot of these smaller entities start to tap larger equity raises and start to tap debt markets, and really that's where the scale will come. And let's face it, we need to accelerate when we look forward at sort of government ambitions where we're doing today. We're doing a lot of really good things in this country, and we've got a lot of early mover advantage, but scalability is going to be absolutely key if we're going to hit the targets, but I think it will come. David, you next.
Yeah, so from our point of view, scalability is really about the size of the projects that we look at. So, talking as I will about buses and trains. I mean, for trains, the fleets that we've bought in the UK are between about 250 million and £1 billion. So those are kind of really big projects, and those are that's the sweet spot for where institutional investors are looking to invest. So I think from that point of view, trains works very well. They're bought at the scale that makes these projects work and means that they can kind of cover all the transaction costs that come with them. I think for buses, it's a bit more of a challenge. They tend to be not quite as large projects as trains are. But I mean, I think it's up to the private sector to look at a way of maybe grouping some of those projects together to get them up to the scale that they need to be, so that they can attract private finance at the lowest rates. So.
Thank you. And Simon.
Thanks. Just a couple of things. I mean, we've heard previously about issues of grid issues of planning affecting scalability, but also I think within the public sector, there's a recognition that they have actually in aggregate across a city or an urban area, the largest holdings of land that can be used for projects to support the decarbonisation of transport. One of the challenges they have is, despite the size of that opportunity, is they're slightly hamstrung in the procurement approach because of the pace of change of technology. You can't really let a concession for EV charging in the public sector because you know that within 5 years the technology will be replaced, but yet you can't describe that in the tender, so the technology can't be upgraded. That's a big issue. But also I think the opportunity for local authorities to effectively innovate around those contractual structures. I mean, a TTLP are going to market with a sort of a joint venture approach, which is complex in its origination as an activity, but will allow innovation to take place within the vehicle that is then set up in the joint venture over a 30 to 40 year lifespan. And part of what we're doing as an organization is sort of trying to write the playbook for how organizations that own a lot of land, principally in public ownership, can do this within urban environments in the UK, across Europe, and more globally, because we are ahead of the curve. You know, within the Périphérique in Paris, there are 6 ultra-rapid chargers. That's not 6 charging locations. That's 6 ultra-rapid chargers. There's lots of slow chargers on streets and in car parks, but they're way behind us. The Baltics have accelerated because of the massive tax concessions, but even then, you know, their charging stations are in locations largely owned by the public sector. And, you know, compared to where you are in the US, if you ignore Tesla, you know, we're years, if not half a decade ahead of where the US is outside the Tesla sort of bubble. But, you know, I think there's plenty of opportunity, but it is around the procurement approach, I think, which is challenging.
Thanks, Simon. I might tackle a couple of the Slido questions that have come in whilst we've been talking. So one of them for you, Rob, was on the relationship between UKIB and the National Infrastructure Commission.
Yeah, I mean, you may not know, but the National Infrastructure Commission recently moved their offices to Leeds. So they're actually based in the same building and same floor as I am up there. So yes, we do engage closely with the National Infrastructure Commission. But we also engage very closely with all of the government departments. We're in actually a very unique position where we really do sit at the heart of the public and private sectors. So, you know, we are very much a commercial financial institution behaving like a private sector investor. So we're out there engaging with all the developers, lenders, investors out there. But at the same time, you know, half of our workforce comes across from the civil service, and we've got really good sort of connections with all of the government departments. And it's a two-way street, all of the engagement that we have. So we provide a lot of, you know, private sector insights and guidance into the government departments, and likewise they share a lot of their kind of thinking and planning work with us, so that we can, you know, try and bring it all together. Through, you know, the way the market's got to evolve over the next few years, we really sort of see the need for strong public and private partnerships going forward. And yeah, UKIB and NIC very much have a role to make sure that it all comes together.
Thanks, Rob. One for you, maybe, Pete. Do investors need to think about longer-term return on investment to invest in decarbonisation projects which may not see returns for a significant period?
Yeah, I think that probably is the case with some sectors. So things like electrification of heat that we're looking at investing in have an awfully long payback because the assets should last for a long time. You know, the assets that we're replacing now as we decarbonise assets will probably have a longer asset life than what they are replacing. So we're getting ourselves comfortable with that longer term hold period. Actually, if I sort of just mention one of the funds that we look after on behalf of the Mayor of London, it's a fund that's got a blend of public and private capital within it, and that has quite unusually a 20-year hold, up to a 20-year hold period on assets, and that was done with the idea that we can finance assets that have a longer life, recognising the technology advances that we're likely to see over the coming years.
Thank you. I might move things on slightly now and talk about government. My perception of the sector is that the government has actually done a lot in terms of creating an environment where people can invest and innovate. To some extent, they've also taken more of a backseat in some things and allowed the market to develop itself. And what I'm interested in knowing is whether you think there's more that government ought to be doing in specific areas to move things forward and drive things to net zero. I'll maybe start with you, Simon.
Thanks. Yes, I think, to pick up on the points from the previous conversation, without delving again into detail, grid is an issue. We have a very resilient grid in this country. Some would argue that it's sort of slightly over-engineered for the task it has in hand. Other networks across other European countries and certainly North America run with levels of tolerance that would be laughed out of the room at an off-gem level. But, they work most of the time. I think there is an opportunity to suggest to Ofgem that it changes its resilience rules for a short-term period to run the grid effectively a little bit hotter for 5 to 10 years, to allow some of these connections to be made in locations where otherwise you've got connections above 1 megawatt now. A connection date of 2030 is not unusual. And I think we need to say that that's not acceptable. There are plenty of ways that resilience can be built into a system, but we are not going to get to where we need to be if everything is 2030. But that's my main point, is that we've got lots of things that sit at a resilience level from the old CEGB days that are now sitting in Ofgem. And I would question whether we might be able to have a conversation about loosening some of those to allow electrification of transport to take place more quickly.
Thanks, Simon. Rob, can I take you next?
Yeah, I think the way I always see it, the main government role has got to be in creating the stable policy environments and the stable regulatory frameworks that create an investable environment. And that needs to be maintained throughout. And I think, in this country, we benefit from very strong policy ambitions with very definite targets for when to decarbonise by. And I think that will drive a lot of investor behaviour, and increasingly so as we get closer and closer. I think, we're also very good in this country, as I said before, at sort of seeding SMEs and nascent sectors with grant funding, and local authorities. Again, they've got a good role to play here in dealing with a lot of the grants and funding that they administer as well. So the Levi Fund in the EV charging sector is a really good example of that. And that really sort of helps create a sector and helps create track record, and that all sort of makes propositions become more investable. And you could argue that we're a little bit more hands-off in terms of allowing the private sector to then invest and scale up industries. But I think that's a good thing. And, we've got a lot of success in this country of the private sector driving investment. But yeah, as long as we get that sort of strong, stable policy regime, then I think it's the absolute right approach to leave it a lot to the private sector.
Yeah, and just jumping in, the Green Investment Bank, which was, the previous iteration, you guys funded and created the stable climate for the entire offshore wind industry. If you hadn't done that, we wouldn't be where we are with offshore wind. And look at how independently and how well that operates now. We have done some extraordinary things in this country in less than 15 years.
So probably just add again to that, actually, and really interesting developments in the offshore wind sector. That yes, it's relied a lot on the CFD and government support throughout. It's created this investable situation where actually a couple of the new developments that are coming to market this year, so I think it's West Moray and Seagreen, are actually starting to rely less on the CFD regime and bring in merchant risk to make it more attractive to investors. So again, it's a really good success story.
David, I might bring in one of the other questions that's come up that touches on one of the themes that we were going to talk about, which is the question was in relation to digital services delivery. And the question was, how do you ensure the UK comes on top? Conscious that Rock has done numerous things overseas. I'm keen to know, where do you see the UK in that sort of competitive market, trying to attract capital from other jurisdictions? And what have you seen elsewhere that you think might work here?
Yeah, I'm probably not going to answer talking too much about digital services if that's okay. But so yes, the UK is an attractive market for kind of public transport, simply because we have a lot of rail and a lot of buses in the UK. So we will, those people need to buy those trains and buses. So it is always going to be an attractive market. I think for trains, very roughly, UK, France and Germany are all about the same size, and the rest of Europe is just about the same size again. So we're a really important market there. How do we ensure the UK comes out on top? So one thing, I'll be very quick on, in the bus sector that we're doing. So bus franchising has been used in London for many years now, and the law changed a couple of years ago to let other city regions outside London introduce bus franchising. So Greater Manchester are leading the way, potentially followed by Liverpool. So I mean, I think franchising services rather than deregulated public transport is something that we can do that will help improve services and give us more joined up public transport.
Okay, Pete, same question to you.
Yeah, I think it's. I'd actually echo quite a lot of what my colleague said before. It's about setting the government policy to make sure that we get that inward investment, and making sure that the right policies are there to allow us to create success. So I don't probably have too much else to add on that point, but I think we are in a global, a global space here, and maybe some of that success will actually also be from our SMEs delivering what we've already incubated here over the last 4 or 5 years into other jurisdictions. So it is a global race, but there's no reason why we can't take what we've already developed here to other countries as well.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so one final question, pretty obvious one. I'm keen to know, in 5 years' time, what does success look like? Maybe a couple of brief thoughts from each of you. I'll start with you, Rob, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think I'll probably keep harking on about this in everything I've said today, but it's partnership for me. It's strong partnerships between local authorities. It's strong partnerships between government and the private sector. It's partnerships between investors and the developers. So success in 5 years, I think it's continuing developing those partnerships and everybody working together.
Simon?
Yes, just picking up on that, I think it's also about expecting that within 5 to 7 years, the future will look like nothing that we could possibly describe today, particularly in certain areas of infrastructure, because the pace of change will be so quick. And also I think that as you follow the sort of digitalization of transport, you will start to bring in mechanisms that allow you to observe, predict, and measure things happening according to sort of, the famous Hewlett-Packard, following Moore's law. And I think the net return on investment from decarbonization is going to become so compelling that people will be attracted to the UK, irrespective of fiscal or monetary incentives. And just picking up on that, you look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is anything but. Really, it's the largest financial policy instrument since the Great Depression under FDR. We could never do that in this country. We're not the world's reserve currency. We can't afford that kind of largesse. But the fundamental point is that the returns and the benefits to this change, if you internalize both the financial return, ESG, and related, health, lifestyle, well-being, longevity, amenity, making cities pleasant places to live without emissions. Those things will be the things that you measure in 5 years.
Pete?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, ultimately the success is a decarbonisation of transport. But I think to make sure that we get there, we need to take everyone on the journey with us. So the public needs to be fully on side with how we decarbonise and see it as a positive, that we're going around in electric vehicles or on micro e-mobility. So I think a success to me would be that we're able to see the decarbonisation as more than just this needs to happen, but to bring people on that journey with us.
And finally, David?
No new diesel vehicles being bought for public transport vehicles, and as many of those that are out there at the moment being retired. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I wish we had double the time and we could keep talking, but could you all thank the audience in the same way, the panel in the same way?